For more on what is next for Starbucks, let's bring in Gautam Mukunda, Tufts professor, author, and leadership expert. Gautam, great to have you with us. I want to get straight to that issue of the protests because it's an interesting one. I mean, we can, see that maybe consumers don't want to pay a lot for coffee, all these various obvious reasons. But in terms of the protests and how the company has handled them, what's your take?
So Starbucks got caught in the protests for just a fluke occurrence where their union used their logo and they sued them. And it's they really haven't taken a stance one way or the other. If I were their management, I'd kind of look and what did we do to deserve this? Seems like a fairly reasonable response to that. But if the protests are the driver of the boycott, of the cuts, and I'm a little skeptical about that, that's the best possible story that management can tell, because it means this is going to go away. This isn't about deeper underlying operational problems. That means that the stuff that Howard Schultz has said is actually irrelevant to their concerns, and everything will be fine in a quarter or two. I'm not persuaded by that story. I do want to sort of pause and sort of have a moment of sympathy for Lakshman Narasimhan. Doing anything with a backseat driver is hard enough.
Yeah.
Leading with a backseat driver who has a James Bond-style eject button to fire you out of the car and has used it twice before
right.
strikes me as a somewhat interesting leadership challenge. When I'm teaching that in class, I think my students would have some great things to say about that. But the basic question that we should be asking, if we assume that whatever happens with the boycotts will end reasonably soon, is Schultz right? And I think that's what we should be focusing on. So I was curious about that. So on my way to the studio, I walked into a Starbucks and I looked around to see what was my take. This is on 6th Avenue in Midtown, presumably a pretty high traffic and important location for them. There was trash on the floor. It looked dingy. The signs were not hung up straight. And if there was any sign that the employees really cared about the appearance of the place, I could not detect it. It seems to me that that's an N of 1 data point, but it's still pretty telling that they are having some bigger operational problems that they should be thinking about.
So is it as easy as Schultz says, go into the store, be closer to the customer, it's all about the store as opposed to the data? I mean, do you get that sense? I mean,
it's never easy. I think when Narasimhan came on, it was actually quite admirable, the extent to which he really went all in to become a Starbucks person. In fact, he still spends half a day working in a store as a barista. I would not want that job. So, good for him. That tells us a lot about his dedication to the culture of the company. But at the same time, he is an outsider, and it's always harder for outsiders to process in this way. This is actually what my books are about. And it can be hard for them to acculturate into that environment in a way that an insider would. Schultz has chosen 3 successors. The first 2 didn't work out that well, and they were also outsiders. So I want to ask this question about what's going on there, that this keeps happening to him.
At the same time, maybe you want somebody from the outside. I mean, maybe you do want, maybe in this case, you want somebody to be from the outside and walk into a store and say, this store is dirty. It used to be clean. Where has this company gone wrong as opposed to somebody who isn't? I mean, I don't know. When you want to clean up a company, oftentimes an outsider is brought in.
So outsiders are change agents, right? And the question that I would ask myself when I'm debating whether to bring an insider or outsider, because change is always a high variance process, right? You could do very well or you could very poorly, but change is going to drive up your variance and outcomes. Is when they brought him in, did they really feel that Starbucks needed a change? Or was continuing on with their strategy and their approach and just honing what it had already done the right approach? When Steve Jobs replaced himself, he didn't pick a change agent. He picked Tim Cook. If you were an Apple shareholder, I think that worked out pretty well for you.
Right.
If you look at what happened with Starbucks, it was the pandemic had a lot of an overlay over it. And I think that's a lot to blame for the workers' morale and everything else, because people were out of the offices. People didn't take the pride in where they worked. And to switch it up, they had to go strong into digital. And now we look back on it, Starbucks was the premium brand. You paid for that experience. So what saved them during the pandemic is hurting them now. Isn't it a case for all of these restaurants? Starbucks might be the poster child for it.
Yeah, it's definitely true that sort of high-end consumption, things like that, are being hit. I heard you talking about McDonald's earlier. We can go down the list of different places that are doing that. It's not a short list. They seem to be hit worse than others. And some of that is definitely fluke stuff. I used to live in China. You spend time in China, and Starbucks is very popular, but you can see challengers to Starbucks that have advantages and that do not have the overhang that Starbucks' close association with the United States is going to cause you in the Chinese market and in other markets too, right at the moment. So I wonder, from Starbucks' case, is they could say, well, we're just getting a worse deal than everybody else because of those things. But again, that is not, right? That's not Schultz's argument at all. He is focused entirely on operational problems. And operational problems are an indictment of a leadership team that has not been around in charge of the company for that long.
So as an expert in leadership, right, and you mentioned change, was one of the things that really caught my ear. Change is inevitable, right? Yeah. And when you're a leader, isn't it part of your task to be able to train the next person that's going to lead in the manner that you want, or at least have, the wherewithal to make a determination about the correct direction of the company going forward? So for me, is this just an indictment on new leadership, or is this also an indictment on pre-existing leadership's inability, because as you said, this is the third time now. It's the third iteration of choosing someone and having it not fail. So that seems to be the common theme throughout this. What's your take there?
The fundamental task of any leader who thinks of themselves as a steward, as opposed to just someone who's squeezing the last drop out of the institution, right, is to hand it off to someone else in better shape than when they found it. Now, whatever shape Schultz hands Starbucks off in, it's in better shape than when he found it, given his extraordinary track record as a CEO. But yeah, he's got to look in the mirror and say, how come if he is not happy with this team, he chose this team, how come this keeps happening to him over and over again, is a serious concern. And at that point, you would say, maybe it's time for the board to step in. Because not in sense of pushing out the CEO, but in saying that, Howard, you have a lot of amazing skills, but maybe picking a successor isn't one of them. And it's time for us to take a larger role in that.